Living anatomy. Herophilus, the butcher of Alexandria, 4th century BC. In the sun-drenched streets of Alexandria, the great library was rising as a beacon of human knowledge. But in the shadows of this enlightenment, a Greek physician named Herophilus was pioneering a far darker path. While his peers studied philosophy and the stars, Herophilus became obsessed with the clockwork of the human body. He wasn't satisfied with the cold, silent anatomy of the deceased. He believed that the secrets of life could only be found while the pulse was still thumping and the blood was still flowing. With the explicit blessing of the Ptolemaic kings, Herophilus was granted access to hundreds of condemned criminals. What followed was a theater of agony that lasted for decades. These were not surgeries, they were vivisections. Imagine being strapped to a cold stone slab in a public square, surrounded by students with notebooks. Without a single drop of anesthetic, which wouldn't be invented for another 2 millennia, Herophilus would take a bronze scalpel and slice through the abdominal wall of a living, breathing human being. He would peel back the skin and muscle to observe the peristalsis of the intestines and the rhythmic contraction of the diaphragm, while the victim was still screaming in a pitch that defied human endurance. He discovered the nervous system by tracing the paths of pain through the bodies of men who were dying in front of him. To Herophilus, these people were not souls. They were living books of flesh, and he intended to read every page until the very moment their hearts stopped beating from sheer exhaustion and blood loss. Poison. The Kamera Laboratory, The Invisible Executioner, 1921. The world was still reeling from the Great War, and the Soviet Union was just beginning to take its terrifying shape. Within the secret folds of the Cheka, the predecessor to the KGB, a facility known as the Chamber, or Laboratory No. 1, was established. Its mission was cold and absolute: create the perfect poison. The Soviet leadership wanted a substance that was colorless, odorless, tasteless, and, most importantly, completely undetectable during an autopsy. They wanted the power to kill an enemy in the middle of a crowded room and have the world believe it was a simple heart attack. To achieve this chemical perfection, the laboratory turned to the only resource the state had in abundance: prisoners from the Gulag system. These men and women were transported to sterile, white-tiled rooms where they were treated like laboratory rats. They were often told they were receiving experimental vaccinations or health tonics to help them survive the harsh labor camps. Instead, they were being fed precise doses of ricin, cyanide, digitoxin, and mustard gas. Doctors would stand behind reinforced glass, stopwatch in hand, recording every twitch, every gasp for air, and every violent convulsion. The ultimate success of the camera was the development of C2, also known as liquid depression. It was a masterpiece of biological horror. When a prisoner was injected with C2, they didn't scream or thrash. Instead, they became strangely calm and weak. Their physical health would undergo a rapid, silent decline. Within 15 minutes, the victim would simply stop moving. To any outside observer, it looked as though they had just fallen into a peaceful sleep. In reality, their internal systems had been systematically shut down, leaving no chemical trace for future coroners to find. The camera proved that the state didn't just want to kill its enemies. It wanted to erase the evidence of their murder. If you're finding these glimpses into the darker side of history, as gripping as they are unsettling, consider leaving a like and subscribing so you don't miss the rest of our journey into the shadows. Now let's look at a case that remains a scar on the history of medicine: infected gays. The Syphilis Massacre in Guatemala, 1946, in the wake of World War II, as the world was establishing the Nuremberg Code to protect human rights, a monster named Dr. John Cutler was leading a secret mission in Guatemala that would stain the reputation of American medicine forever. Funded by the US government, Cutler's goal was to study the effectiveness of penicillin, but his methods were nothing short of demonic. He didn't wait for people to get sick. He turned the entire country into a breeding ground for STDs. Cutler and his team targeted the most vulnerable members of society: soldiers, mental health patients, and even orphans as young as 10 years old. They would pay infected prostitutes to sleep with prisoners to spread syphilis and gonorrhea. When that wasn't fast enough, the doctors turned to more direct, brutal methods. They would scrape the skin of a victim's arm or genitals and pour concentrated bacteria directly into the open wound. In some cases, they performed lumbar punctures, injecting the disease straight into the spinal fluid. The story of a patient named Berta serves as a chilling testament to Cutler's lack of humanity. Berta was a psychiatric patient who had been infected with syphilis by the team. As she lay dying, her body wasting away from the infection and her skin covered in lesions, Cutler decided to perform one last test. He He took pus from another infected man and injected it into Berta's eyes to see if she would develop a secondary infection before she expired. She died shortly after in unimaginable pain, bleeding from her eyes and genitals. For years, the records of this experiment were buried in dusty archives while the victims and their families were left to rot, never receiving the cure that was sitting in the doctor's bags the entire time. Radioactive snow? Project 4.1, The Radioactive Harvest. 1954. High above the turquoise waters of the Marshall Islands, the horizon was torn apart by a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. The Castle Bravo nuclear test was a catastrophic success, detonating with a force of 15 megatons, over 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But the wind shifted, and a thick, snow-like ash began to fall over the inhabited atolls of Rongelap and Uttarik. This wasn't snow, it was highly radioactive fallout. Instead of an immediate evacuation and decontamination effort, the United States military saw a unique opportunity. They launched Project 4.1, a secret study designed to observe the long-term effects of radiation on a living human population. For the next several decades, the Marshallese people were treated not as citizens, but as biological sensors. Scientists would arrive in white suits to take blood samples and bone marrow, watching with detached curiosity as the population's health disintegrated. Women began giving birth to what they called jellyfish babies, infants born without bones and with transparent skin, who lived only a few hours. Children developed massive tumors on their thyroids, and the elderly suffered from strange, weeping skin burns that never healed. When the islanders begged for help, they were told the radiation levels were safe. In reality, the scientists were meticulously documenting how radiation travels through the food chain and into the human womb. For the architects of the Cold War, the suffering of an entire island nation was simply the necessary price for the data they needed to plan for a global nuclear apocalypse. Head transplant. The Soviet Frankenstein, The Legend of the Head Transfer, 1959. As the space race heated up, a different, more macabre race was happening in the basements of Soviet research institutes. While the world watched the launch of Sputnik, rumors began to leak out about a project so bizarre it sounded like a ghost story from the Kremlin. The inspiration came from Dr. Vladimir Demikov, a brilliant but eccentric surgeon who had successfully created two-headed dogs by grafting the head of a puppy onto the neck of a full-grown German shepherd. But the legend suggests the Soviets didn't stop at animals. Rumors persisted of a secret Frankenstein experiment involving a soldier who had been decapitated in a horrific accident. Using a primitive heart-lung machine to keep the brain oxygenated, the team supposedly attempted to graft the soldier's head onto the healthy body of a donor. Unlike the movies where the monster wakes up and goes on a rampage, the real Frankenstein was a tragedy of biology. The legend claims that for approximately 9 seconds, the connection held, the soldier's eyes allegedly snapped open, darting around the room in a state of primal existential terror. He supposedly tried to form a word, a plea for help, or a scream of agony, but without the vocal cords being properly integrated, all that emerged was a wet, gargling sound of air and blood. The brain, unable to handle the massive surge of foreign hormones and the trauma of the procedure, suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage moments later. The Soviet government allegedly scrubbed every photograph and every line of text regarding the human trial, leaving behind only the haunting suspicion that for 9 seconds they had forced a man to live through the ultimate nightmare. Log Factory. Unit 731. The Factory of Death, 1935. In the frozen plains of Manchuria, the Imperial Japanese Army built a sprawling complex that the local villagers were told was a lumber mill. To the officers inside, the prisoners were not people, they were maruta, or logs. Unit 731 was the most sophisticated and brutal biological warfare laboratory in human history, led by the fanatical Dr. Shiro Ishii. Here, the boundaries of human cruelty were not just crossed, they were obliterated. The experiments performed at Unit 731 were a catalog of pure sadism. Doctors would perform amputations on living prisoners without anesthesia just to study the limits of surgical shock. They would then attempt to sew the removed limbs onto the opposite side of the body to see if they would take. They tested the effects of extreme pressure by placing victims in hyperbaric chambers until their eyes literally popped out of their sockets. To study the progression of STDs, they forced male and female prisoners to mate at gunpoint after infecting one of them with syphilis. Perhaps most horrific were the field tests. Unit 731 would drop plague bombs, ceramic pots filled with fleas infected with the bubonic plague, over Chinese cities to see how many thousands would die. They tied prisoners to stakes and tested flamethrowers and chemical grenades on them from various distances. In the winter, they would force prisoners outside and drench their limbs in water until they were frozen solid, then beat the frozen flesh with hammers to see how it shattered. The greatest injustice of all came in 1945. As the war ended, the United States made a secret deal. In exchange for the data gathered from these atrocities, data that was ethically unobtainable in the West, the leaders of Unit 731 were given full immunity. They weren't executed. Many went on to become successful doctors, university deans, and even founders of major pharmaceutical companies. The screams of the logs were traded for secret files, proving that in the cold world of geopolitics, the most horrific crimes can be forgiven if the price is right. From the ancient slabs of Alexandria to the secret bunkers of the Cold War, history shows us that when science loses its soul, it becomes the ultimate monster. These stories are a reminder that the quest for knowledge can sometimes lead us directly into the heart of darkness. Which of these cases do you find the most disturbing? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.